Picture this moment. There you are standing before what looks like mechanical poetry, cast in steel. This is Patton. This is also a Patton. And this beast behind me, this is Patton II, literally the second tank to carry that legendary name. But was it just another stopgap? A placeholder in the grand theater of armored warfare? Was it one Patton too many? Today, we dive deep into a story that might just change how you see the most misunderstood tank in American history. During those sweltering August weeks when the Korean peninsula burned with the fury of war, enemy forces hammered the perimeter line again and again. They had boasted loudly that they would push UN forces into the sea, watching them drown in their own retreat. But something remarkable happened. That line held firm, like an immovable object meeting an unstoppable force, and behind that defensive wall stood machines that would define the next chapter of armored warfare. Just like its predecessor, the M47 story was born from the chaos and desperate needs of the Korean conflict. Picture this. Modern American tanks were as scarce as honest politicians. The M46 had performed admirably as a temporary solution in the Asian theater, but military strategists lay awake at night with cold sweats. They knew that if this war exploded beyond Korea's borders and dragged Europe into the inferno, pitting the Soviet bloc directly against NATO forces, their current tanks would be outclassed faster than a horse facing a Ferrari. The terrifying reality was that even while engineers were still tinkering with the M46's improvements over the M26 Pershing, the tank that would become the M47 was already taking shape in someone's imagination. It started life as something far more ambitious, a complete redesign called the T-42 medium tank. This wasn't just tweaking existing technology, this was starting from scratch, erasing every trace of the M26's DNA that critics had been complaining about even in the M46. Military brass originally recommended the T-42 for full production, but field commanders raised their hands with urgent concerns. They worried that, just like the old Pershing, this experimental machine might prove underpowered when the bullets started flying. More testing was desperately needed, but time had become their most precious and rapidly disappearing commodity. Then came the moment that changed everything. Like a thunderbolt from hell itself, Chinese communist troops came streaming across the Manchurian border, their presence transforming the Korean conflict from a regional skirmish into something far more terrifying. These weren't just a few advisors or token forces. Intelligence estimated 75,000 Chinese communist fighters already engaged in Korean combat, with another 500,000 positioned just across the border in Manchuria, creating a threat that made seasoned generals lose sleep. But here's where the story takes an interesting turn. While Korea certainly created massive anxiety throughout the American military establishment, it also provided invaluable proof that the M46 Patton's revolutionary new transmission and engine had successfully solved the mobility and power problems that had plagued earlier designs. Meanwhile, back on proving grounds, the T-42's advanced armament and fire control systems were showing tremendous promise in controlled testing environments. The solution that emerged seemed almost beautifully simple in its practicality. Take the proven M46 chassis that had demonstrated its reliability under combat conditions, marry it to the promising T-42 turret with its advanced systems, and create yet another stopgap tank. In fact, this would be the ultimate stopgap, a stopgap designed to replace another stopgap, like Russian nesting dolls of military compromise. November 1950 marked a pivotal moment in American tank development history. This hybrid combination received the official designation 90mm gun tank M47, even though standardization hadn't been completed yet. This decision was unprecedented, naming and ordering a tank before it had passed through the complete approval process. But desperate times called for desperate measures, and the vehicle needed to enter production immediately. By June 1951, standardization was expected to follow quickly, so to prevent confusion in factories and field units, M47 it became. More specifically, the Patton II. Walking through a tank museum today offers a unique perspective that few people ever experience. Having both an M47 Patton II and an M46 Patton in the same collection allows for side-by-side comparison that reveals fascinating details. Both tanks share significant amounts of DNA, meaning they have numerous identical components. The most critical shared elements include the engine and transmission systems. The massive piece of machinery that powers both vehicles is the CD850 series transmission. To be technically precise, the M47 uses the CD850-5 variant. The transmission in the original M46 Patton was virtually identical, though it used the CD853 designation. This transmission connected to a massive 12-cylinder Continental gasoline engine designated AV17925A. However, the M46 shown alongside the M47 in many museums isn't just a standard M46A, it's actually an M46A1 featuring improved engine and transmission systems. The engine became the 5B instead of 5A, while the transmission upgraded from a 3 to a 4 designation. If you want to impress the roughly dozen people worldwide who actually know detailed M47 specifications, you can accurately state that it shares the exact same engine and transmission as the M46A1 Patton. But there's a fascinating detail that many M47 tanks should have, but are mysteriously missing. And it's not a fault of the original design, but rather how field modifications evolved over time. Look carefully behind the larger bogie wheel on most M47 tanks, and you'll notice a small mount that's been plated over. This mounting point was originally designed for what engineers called the track tension idler, a smaller wheel that would extend outward and press down on the track to maintain proper tension. While the M46 retained its tension idler throughout its service life, and the M47 was originally designed to include one, many M47 tanks had their idlers removed during post-production modifications. Field experience revealed this component to be redundant, and removal simplified maintenance procedures. Today's museum collections tell this story perfectly. Of the 3 M47 tanks in most major collections, 2 typically have their idlers removed, while 1 retains what mechanics jokingly called its training wheels. This small detail illustrates how military equipment evolves through practical experience, rather than just theoretical design. The most obvious changes to the M47 center around that distinctive T-42 turret, which creates a truly unique silhouette completely different from earlier American tank designs. The longer rear bustle and the characteristic ears on either side immediately identify where the advanced fire control system sits, essentially the sophisticated scope system for the main cannon. The triangular gun mantle gives the M47 a distinctive appearance that some observers have compared to medieval armor, though others suggest it resembles something far less dignified. The T-42 turret proved so much larger at its base than the M46 turret that engineers had to increase the turret ring diameter just to fit the new component onto the existing chassis. This modification required significant structural changes to the hull, demonstrating the challenges of creating hybrid designs under wartime pressure. Beyond the obvious turret differences, numerous subtle modifications distinguished the M47 from its predecessor. For example, testing during summer 1951 revealed that the number of track return rollers could be reduced from 5 to 3 without affecting performance. This change simplified manufacturing and reduced maintenance requirements, though some museum M46 tanks also lacked the full complement of return rollers due to their own field modification programs. The list of component removals extended to crew controls as well. Unlike the M46, which provided full driving controls for both the driver's position and the bow gunner position, the M47 returned the bow gunner to the simpler duty of operating only the machine gun. This change foreshadowed future developments because after the M47, military planners concluded that the bow gunner position was entirely redundant and eliminated it completely. This makes the M47 historically significant as the last United States tank to actually employ a bow gunner. Examining the bow section reveals another important modification. The M47 changed the slope of its front armor plate to 60 degrees, much steeper than its predecessor. However, this modification led to what many consider the M47's greatest sin against crew comfort. The beloved air conditioning system had to be removed, technically called a rotocone blower. This system had previously been positioned between the driver and bow gunner positions, creating that distinctive bump on the vehicle's front plate. Instead of providing cooling to the front crew members, The system was relocated to the rear of the turret bustle, meaning those greedy dudes back in the turret now hogged all the fresh air while the driver and bowgunner sweltered. Returning to the turret systems reveals the complexity of wartime development pressures. Remember those critical tests mentioned earlier that removed various controls and return rollers? Those same evaluations identified a comprehensive suite of problems with the turret itself. Originally, the T-42 was designed to mount a mechanical stabilizer system to prevent the gun from bouncing while moving. Manufactured initially by IBM, yes, the same company that would later dominate computer technology. However, for the sake of beginning production during summer 1950, remember this entire tank represented a rushed development program. The stabilizer was removed to accelerate the timeline. This created an unexpected problem. None of the turret components had been tested without the stabilizer installed. By the end of summer 1951, 15 separate modifications were recommended before the M47 could be considered ready for field deployment. These changes included improvements to the power traverse system for left and right movement, and elevation systems for up and down cannon movement, specifically designed to prevent lag in turret response. With all similarities and modifications properly addressed, the M47, whether you called it Patton II, Patton 47, or 90mm gun tank M47, depending on who and when you asked, received official standardization in April 1952. By the time production ceased in November 1953, over 8,570 Pattons had rolled off American assembly lines. By that time, however, the M47 was already being overshadowed by yet another Patton variant, the M48, still designated as the T48 during development, and the need for this particular stopgap had effectively passed. The interior of the M47 turret provided about as much space as the M46 before it, which meant there was basically no space at all unless crew members enjoyed getting intimately acquainted with the 90mm cannon. While the M46 used a 90mm M3A1 cannon, the M47 featured the same caliber weapon but with significant improvements. This new gun was initially designated the T119, though the version installed in the M47 was the T119E1, later standardized as the 90mm cannon M36. Identifying different versions of this gun from outside the tank is relatively straightforward because of the muzzle brake design. Late production M36 cannons featured the distinctive T-shaped muzzle brake, while early production weapons used a more cylindrical design. The T119E1 delivered higher muzzle velocity than the original M3A1, providing significantly improved penetrating power. The E1 designation also indicated this gun could fire ammunition designed for the older M3A1 system alongside newer rounds specifically developed for the enhanced cannon, providing logistical flexibility that field commanders greatly appreciated. Ammunition storage in the M47 followed conventional patterns with some improvements. The turret contained 11 positions for ready rounds, ammunition easily accessible during combat operations. An additional 60 rounds were stored beneath the turret, though these could be difficult to access depending on turret position. This gave the M47 a total ammunition capacity of 71 rounds, exactly one more than the M46, which hardly represented a revolutionary improvement but demonstrated attention to detail. Beyond the 90mm main gun and auxiliary equipment, the most distinctive feature running from ear to ear across the turret was the stereoscopic rangefinder. This represented the M47's advanced fire control system, essentially a sophisticated scope for the main gun. But understanding why this complex system was necessary requires explaining how it functioned and what advantages it provided over simpler alternatives. Unlike previous American tanks that used single telescopes for range finding, this binocular eyepiece performed a crucial function by taking two images and combining them to create an optical illusion that tricked the operator's brain. Just like 3D glasses in movie theaters, the rangefinder captured two separate images from slightly different angles. When looking through the sight, the operator's brain subconsciously combined these images to create depth perception that appeared remarkably realistic. The field manual for the M47 provided detailed explanation of this process. When looking through the scope, operators saw a V-shaped pattern in the upper center called the ranging reticle. The manual stated that rotating the range knob to increase range caused this reticle to appear to move away from the gunner. The technique involved keeping the top of the V near the observer while adjusting until the bottom reached the target, indicating proper range had been established. This entire process relied on optical illusion created by the stereoscopic effect rather than complex electronics, allowing precise range finding using purely mechanical systems. For those unfamiliar with tank operations, this might seem impossibly complex to integrate with the main gun, but the opposite was true. The systems were completely linked. Almost every American tank up to this point, whether Sherman or Pershing, used what engineers called a coaxial sight, meaning that as the gun elevated or depressed, the sight automatically moved with it. A gunner using controls to move the weapon up or down would see the gun move while the scope followed automatically on the vehicle's exterior, ensuring that regardless of gun position, the sight remained properly aligned through purely analog technology. M47 production ended in November 1953, mere months after the Korean War concluded, but the tank never saw combat in that conflict and never would with American forces. However, its story was far from over. The M47 suddenly found itself thrust into various testing programs, some designed to improve existing systems, while others tested technology for future main battle tank development. These programs ranged from logical upgrades to examples that seemed almost like science fiction. Starting with experimental variants, the first modified M47 in early 1952 added a gun stabilizer, taken directly from the British Centurion tank, creating the M47E1 variant. This configuration showed tremendous promise, but was never fully produced since M47 manufacturing was already winding down. Following the E1 during summer 1954, the M47E2 variant addressed ammunition storage problems. Since retrieving 90mm rounds from underneath the turret was occasionally difficult, military engineers eliminated the bow gunner entirely and replaced his position with an ammunition rack to improve access and increase total capacity. The upper hatch over the former bow gunner position was proposed to mount two 30 caliber machine guns side by side, but this modification was never adopted. The few E2 variants produced served more as proof of concept demonstrations. Since M47 production had ceased in 1954, these modifications would only matter if emergency situations required existing fleet upgrades, making the M47E2 an admittedly promising but ultimately theoretical design. The award for strangest American upgrade proposal goes to Uber Manufacturing Company, is suggestion to install steam engines in main battle tanks during the early 1960s. The Army actually reviewed this proposal, and while the suggested engine might have provided more power than contemporary systems, implementing steam power would prove too expensive and too difficult to maintain. While the M47 was chosen for steam system installation, no prototype was ever constructed, which represents a real historical loss, because steam-powered tanks in Vietnam would have been absolutely spectacular to witness. Despite never seeing combat with American forces during its rushed development for the Korean War and deployment to Germany during the Cold War, America decided that as better tanks entered production, the M47 would be better suited as exports to NATO allies and many other nations worldwide. Most recipient countries fell under the NATO umbrella, and many were still recovering from World War II's economic devastation. Like the wartime Lend-Lease program that proved invaluable for arming allies, America again served as the world's primary arms dealer during the 1950s. The M47 formed part of numerous policies designed to ensure countries bordering the Iron Curtain were properly equipped to resist Soviet invasion. It became the first modern tank utilized by West Germany and the first modern tank arriving in Belgium, France, and Austria. While many dismiss this tank as merely a stopgap, this perspective misses the US government's actual intentions. The M47 wasn't expected to simply hold the line until replacement was found. It was genuinely intended to serve in open warfare against Soviet forces, and that capability was built into the design from the beginning. Consequently, The M47 represented a crucial factor in theoretical NATO defense of Western Europe, a scenario that fortunately never materialized. Among export highlights, Italy ended up owning 30% of all M47s ever manufactured. Yugoslavia presents an interesting case because despite being communist, the country still managed to acquire M47s through America's military assistance program, demonstrating the complex geopolitical relationships of the Cold War period. European service also sparked foreign attempts to improve the basic design. France managed to install a 105mm gun in place of the 90mm system to increase firepower. Italy and eventually Pakistan reduced the M47's notorious fuel consumption by replacing the gasoline engine with a diesel unit manufactured by MTU, a German company. This water-cooled engine produced 750 net horsepower compared to the original Continental engine's 704 net horsepower, providing modest improvement while dramatically improving fuel efficiency. These international improvement efforts led Americans to re-examine their own tank in 1968, over a decade after production had ended. The initiative involved taking as many components as possible from the newer M60A1 and adapting them for the M47 to simplify future parts production and logistics. The pilot tank for this modernization program, designated M47M, was completed in 1969. It included the M60's larger diesel engine, top deck modifications, and grille door improvements. The remaining track return rollers were repositioned toward the rear, and the track tension idler was completely eliminated. The bow gunner position was removed entirely, and another ammunition rack was added, similar to the earlier M47E2 variant. Finally, a hydraulic gun control system from Cadillac Gauge Company was installed to improve fire control capabilities. This variant proved extremely popular, and from 1972 to 1974, 400 M47s were converted to M47M specification. Of these, 147 went to Pakistan, while the remainder were destined for Iran before the 1978 Iranian Revolution. Before that political upheaval, Iran had been America's ally of convenience due to Soviet influence to the north, and during the 1970s received massive amounts of American military equipment, including M47 tanks. While the M47 never developed a combat history with United States forces, it ironically tested its capabilities on battlefields across Africa and the Middle East in the hands of American allies, who sometimes became adversaries. One of the most overlooked conflicts in recent history is the Iran-Iraq War of the 1980s, a fascinating study in how foreign influence shaped modern warfare and paved the way for future Middle Eastern conflicts. When Iraq suddenly invaded Iran in 1980, the Iranians found themselves essentially isolated from international support, still rebuilding from their recent revolution. Their only available military technology consisted of 1970s surplus equipment. M47 tanks, alongside American Phantom jets and older British vehicles, rolled into battle to halt the Iraqi invasion. However, the Iraqi armored Spearhead featured modern T-62 and T-72 tanks provided by the Soviets, making the M47 clearly a generation behind current technology. Specific combat reports regarding Iranian M47 performance are difficult to locate, but considering two crucial factors, reasonable conclusions can be drawn. First, the Iraqi invasion achieved significant early success primarily due to armored columns. Second, the Iraqi advance was mainly repelled through massed infantry attacks rather than tank versus tank combat. These factors strongly suggest that M47s performed poorly against newer Soviet-built counterparts. A photograph taken during America's first Gulf War in the early 1990s perfectly illustrates this point. M47 tanks, not destroyed but simply abandoned, lie scattered in a yard filled with captured equipment outside Baghdad. This image summarizes the M47's combat experience. A tank that never fought during its technological prime, which was probably fortunate since that would have meant World War III, but when it finally reached battlefields, it served out of necessity rather than preference. This Iranian-Iraqi example demonstrates why the M47 shouldn't simply disappear into historical obscurity. When people think about tanks, they want something big, dramatic, and associated with well-known battles and iconic stories. They want something like the movie Fury, not the tank usually painted to represent enemy panzers in minor film appearances like the Devil's Brigade or the Rat Patrol. But that's precisely why the M47 represents one of America's most interesting tanks. For every M1 Abrams, every Centurion, and every Leopard 2 that captures popular imagination, the M47 serves as a bridge between the desperate improvisations of World War II and the sophisticated systems of modern warfare. It represents American industrial capability under pressure, the challenges of Cold War military planning, and the complex relationships between allies that shaped global politics for decades. Most importantly, it demonstrates how military technology evolves not through dramatic breakthroughs, but through incremental improvements, field experience, and lessons learned from both success and failure. Looking at the M47 today, whether in a museum restoration shop or reading about its scattered service around the world, you're not just seeing a tank, you're witnessing a moment in time when American engineers and military planners faced an uncertain future and created something that, while imperfect, served its intended purpose of bridging the gap between what was and what would become. In that sense, the M47 Patton represents far more than just another stopgap solution. It embodies the pragmatic ingenuity that has characterized American military development throughout the modern era. That's why this tank, despite never achieving the fame of its predecessors or successors, despite never fighting the war it was designed for, despite being dismissed as just another temporary measure, is absolutely anything but boring. Sometimes the most interesting stories are found not in the headlines but in the footnotes, not in the victories but in the preparations, not in the famous battles, but in the quiet service of machines and the people who operated them during the long, tense decades when the world held its breath and waited to see what would come next.